Professor Andrei Codrescu.
Thank you. Thank you, Professors Alcorn and Delio, for those lovely words. And I'm very happy to be here as a guest in part of the American Book Review, which I think is an amazing journal. And I don't know how many of you have seen it, but you have a literary monster in your midst. It's like if the New York Times Book Review decided to relocate to Victoria, Texas. I mean, the American Book Review was founded years ago by a dear friend of mine, Ron Suknik, who, in response, really, to the New York Times Book Review, which was not reviewing new writers and new writing, decided that he would start his own review journal. And the American Book Review was born as an alternative to the kinds of books and writing that the New York Times Book Review and the New York Review of Books even was publishing at the time. And it's, I can't believe it's been 30 years, actually, almost 30 years since this magazine has been around. And it's here. And now it's with you here. And I think that's just an amazing thing. So I really wish you all the best with it. I mean, I don't know what else I would find out the news of about the really interesting books coming out if it wasn't for that magazine. And it's good to be here. I live not very far. I mean, New Orleans isn't really very far, except once you cross the border to Texas, everything is sort of far for people not from here. But it's not far, and some of you may have been there. But I'm going to talk a little bit about New Orleans as a written city, because New Orleans, in addition to being everything that everybody thinks New Orleans is, and New Orleans very obligingly always is what you think it is when you get there. It's one of those cities that takes on the sort of your fantasies and your imagination of it and then delivers. I don't know, it's a kind of magic. But in addition to all of that, it is a city that writers have loved forever. And, for almost since the beginning of the founding of the city, people have wanted to write stories about it, and fiction, and essays, and all sorts of things. It was partly the fact that since it was one of our oldest cities, there was a great mix of people there, and it was interesting to observers, to writers. The earliest. I'll read you some of my own writings about it too, but I discovered an amazing book. It's called The Mysteries of New Orleans. It was written in the mid-19th century by Baron von Riesenstein. Von Riesenstein was a real a German nobleman, a baron, who was sent to New Orleans by his parents around the age of 20 to get him away from what they called the revolutionary troubles in Germany. And so he got to New Orleans a young man, and he started writing for one of the two German newspapers being published in New Orleans in the mid-19th century. One was called the Louisiana Stadtzeitung, and it was the two newspapers actually served a German immigrant population that could support two papers, and one of them was sort of the mainstream paper, and then there was the Louisiana Stadtzeitung, which was the Bohemian German paper. It was full of radical writings from Germany, and von Riesenstein started writing a serial novel in Louisiana Stadtzeitung called The Mysteries of New Orleans. And in those days, serial novels were being published in newspapers, and the trick about serial novels was that they told stories about the place where you were and left a hook at the end so that you would buy the paper the next day. And this genre of the mysteries was already, was in Pittsburgh, the mysteries of Pittsburgh. Then in the New World, the mysteries existed. But von Riesenstein was writing about New Orleans, a very wild city, and so he had a big job to do. One, he had to be accurate, because whatever he wrote about, people could check. So if he wrote about scandals or he named even streets, they had to be there. And secondly, he wanted to exercise this wild imagination, and he made it into a magical city. And he started telling absolutely fantastic stories about New Orleans and things that happened there. They were almost ghost stories. There is a 1,000-year-old man in this mysteries of New Orleans. There are the seeds of the yellow fever which are being brought to the city by a sort of a vampiric immortal. There is a murderous priest. There is a very vivid description for the first time in American literature, maybe in European literature, of lesbian lovemaking. Amazing stuff. And this is in the daily paper that people picked up and read and complained about, too. There are letters to the editor, things like, we could see this in a book, but, we don't think it has any place in the newspaper that anybody could read. It costs only a penny. So this book was finally translated from the German. A professor at the university, at Hopkins University, Stephen Rowan, collected very patiently all the old issues, collated them, translated them, annotated them very nicely, and the book was published just before Katrina, about 3 or 4 months, and it was fitting in some way because it connected the current literature of New Orleans with its beginnings. After von Riesenstein, a lot of writers came to New Orleans. Mark Twain, of course, was in New Orleans and wrote, about the city. But people that you would not think about, like Walt Whitman, the great American poet who spent time in New Orleans after the Civil War and wrote for New Orleans newspaper. Then writers just regularly made it sort of, American writers made it part of their training to go to New Orleans and spend some time there. A little bit like at other times and in other periods, you had to go to Paris or you had to go to New York. You had to live in New York for a while, do time there to be a writer, because that's where all the other writers were, and that's how you learned your craft. And there were people whose houses you went to and talked about writing. And New Orleans became a bit like that at various times. Faulkner, of course, William Faulkner wrote his first novel in the French Quarter called Soldier's Pay. There is a little plaque, marking the fact that 23 years old William Faulkner lived there and wrote his first novel while drinking a lot of whiskey and pursuing all the other illicit pleasures that New Orleans has always suffered. And F. Scott Fitzgerald, who was from the other side of the Mississippi River, from St. Paul, Minnesota, wrote his first book, This Side of Paradise, in New Orleans, in an apartment looking over the Lafayette Cemetery, one of my favorite places in New Orleans. I'll read you a little bit about that. I always thought the title, This Side of Paradise, came from the fact that Scotty stayed up very late one night and feeling quite hungover in the morning, he looked out the window at the cemetery and said, "It ain't so hot on this side of paradise." A wonderful cemetery, actually, that I've used as a kind of coffee house. I'll tell you about that in a minute. So let me read you just a few things about New Orleans that have something to do with the fact that it is a writer's city, why it is a writer's city, what it has given writers and what it gives us now, and the fact that now after the storm it has entered a whole new stage of its existence. And already there have been, since Katrina, there have been something like 30 books written both about Katrina and about New Orleans, and a lot of photography books. It's been the most photographed disaster in American history. And at one point I thought we were in danger of becoming the most overwritten city in American history. This happens sometimes, that things get written about so much that they sink and disappear, and all that's left are the books, which is not bad. But New Orleans is in no danger of that because it provides raw material and stories continually. So, this is some prefatory remarks to New Orleans, Mon Amour. How did we fall in love? At first sight, violently. I came to visit my friend Philip Herter in New Orleans at Mardi Gras in 1982. He had a house full of friends in various states of dress and undress who stayed up all night, slipping in and out of his apartment in the bywater, coming back in different clothes, towing in strangers, stories, news of yet another more amazing party somewhere in a few minutes, in a few seconds. Masked creatures floated by in a swirl of feathers. Night parades went by a few blocks away. Flambeau-lit torches preceded brass bands leading huge floats bearing massive gods and goddesses under whose heads masked celebrants threw treasures to frenzied mobs. Time was uncertain, like names and faces, and I found myself in a park at the edge of the French Quarter, sleeping in the grass next to Heather, a red-haired, fiery person to whom I dedicated a poem, Dear Mazoc. The masoch part had to do with the fact that she turned out to be Philip's girlfriend, and my passion went nowhere except toward masochism. Mazoch, by the way, is the guy who gave masochism its name. His name was Ernst Mazoch. We made him do it. He was a lawyer. He was a Viennese lawyer, and he wrote a book. He wrote a book called Venus in Furs, and it's about a contract that a man makes with a woman to be punished. I mean, the man to be punished by the woman. And it's a contract. And he was a lawyer, so he wrote everything down. You know, how many lashes, you know, how many times he had to be slapped or punished or whatever. I can't remember now. But, yeah, masochism is this sort of lawyerly, you know, vice. I carried that fabulous image of New Orleans with me like a poetic wound for the next 2 years. I kept in touch with friends who lived there, artist types who fascinated neophytes with tales of their city. Later, when I started living there, I caught the mythifying of New Orleans virus, too. The city that Mark Twain called the upholstered sewer. This is actually one of Mark Twain's more inspired, angry sallies at New Orleans, the upholstered sewer. So my friends call it that too now. It's just, how is the upholstered sewer? That was before the storm, actually, you know, when it could be sort of more affectionate in a more aggressive way. I think the poor city can't stand that now quite. The city that Mark Twain called the upholstered sewer generated stories like water from a faucet left on everywhere you looked. A friend's child actually once exclaimed, "I'm first seeing Lake Pontchartrain, the 10th largest lake in America. Mommy, somebody left the faucet on." Yeah, the mouth of babes, you know. It's a very prodigious and fertile city. The mythifying of New Orleans started early, but from nothing but the facts. And this is the story I told you. I recall it here. The young Baron Ludwig von Riesenstein was sent away from the troubles of revolutionary Germany in the 1840s to New Orleans, where he landed penniless and started writing a serial novel for one of the 2 German-language daily newspapers published there. So in talking about this novel, I also remarked that the dead are everywhere in his book. There are a lot of people who are, you know, either, you know, have died and come back to life, or they live for a very long time, or, you know, there's this blood-sucking immortal who's over 500 years old, and the mysterious plants. And anyway, Baron von Riesenstein's own career was very interesting, because after he wrote these mysteries, the paper failed financially, or was closed down because of his pro-abolitionist sympathies. So after the Civil War, it just didn't exist anymore. And the Baron became a scholar of butterflies, a lepidopterist. And he wrote a book that's still in use now. He classified and collected all the butterflies in Louisiana. So by the time that Mark Twain and George Washington Cable and these other writers came to New Orleans in the 1860s, late 1860s, they knew von Riesenstein as this eccentric, skinny butterfly man who hung out in the French Quarter. And they had no idea that he'd been a writer, and a great writer. So that happens too. Essentially, you only have to write one book. You know, it's got to be great. And even if it doesn't come out in book form, you know, you should project into the future and have a German professor about 100 years in the future find it, publish it, translate it, and make it happen again. That happens. So we have the American Book Review actually to make sure that doesn't happen, you know, that you're not forgotten so quickly. So, and here's another story. about the magic of New Orleans. And this is, again, there is magic in this city. The muddy, the perverse, the magical, and the inexplicable always had an apocalyptic tinge to it. I hadn't read The Mystery of New Orleans when I wrote Messiah, my own novel of New Orleans, but the two novels could be twins separated by a century and a half. The miraculous and profoundly magical substance that New Orleans has produced for its entire existence rises from both books like thick fog over the Mississippi River. I'll recall a single incident from the time when I wrote Messiah, and I didn't invent a single thing. This is true. In fact, you know what? Instead of reading it, I'll read it. I was going to tell it to you, but I probably will forget details that are in here. It was a fall day in 1998, and I was having a hard time with Felicity, one of the principal characters in Messiah. She was refusing to evolve past a certain point. This is a problem, it's a technical problem. Sometimes you have with your characters. She was refusing to evolve to a certain point, so I opened at random my copy of Nag Hammadi, the Gnostic Gospels. This is a collection of Gospels that were left out of the Bible, but were written with their contemporary or written a little later after the four Gospels in there, and they're called the Gnostic Gospels or the Nag Hammadi. So I opened this book, translated by Willis Barnstone, to ask for guidance. I do this sometimes. I'll just open a book at random, and I call it oracular reading. So I kept the Nag Hammadi close by my desk for oracular readings regarding Felicity, who was a natural-born Gnostic. She is in the book. The Nag opened to a page. The first line read, "Our sister Sophia, she who is a whore." That didn't seem to help much, but I typed the line into the file anyway. I shut down my laptop and went around the corner to Molly's, which was my living room, more or less, in those days. I was always bound to run into somebody I knew at Molly's. I looked around but didn't know anybody, so I sat at the window and ordered the Jim Beam on the rocks. I was just sinking into a pleasantly warm whiskey buzz looking out at the street. It was near sunset and all the freaks were out. Extravagantly tattooed youths, skateboarders, confused tourists, drug dealers, hookers, itinerant musicians, pickpockets, waiters and busboys leaving or going to work. I was dreaming away when somebody from behind hugged me with skinny girl arms and whispered in my ear, "Do you want to hear the name of my new band?" "No," I said, because there is nothing I dislike more than the names of young people's bands. Actually, I've sat in all-night sessions, of baby and band naming, and they're just excruciating. "I'll tell it to you anyway," she said. "It's our sister Sophia, she who is a whore." My hair, or what's left of it anyway, stood up on my head and on my arms, and two possibilities presented themselves instantly to my mind. One, this girl, whose name I later found out was Michelle, had looked over my shoulder when I opened the book in my apartment and typed the line, though I knew that there hadn't been anybody there. And two, the page had printed itself and had followed me down the street, where it had been found by this complete stranger who then decided to name her new rock band after it. There were no other possibilities. So I just sort of stuttered. I said, "Well, that's a line from the Gnostic Gospels." "Why, no," she said. "I've been reading it since I was 14. So I found out in short order that she was the lead singer of her new band, that she made a living stripping at Big Daddy's on Bourbon Street, and that she was in imminent danger at that very moment of being captured by a strong emergency room nurse named Susan, who was in love with her. All of this happens at Molly's, So. I ended up having a tremendous conversation. Well, you can read the rest of it in there, but I ended up having this tremendous conversation with her, and she seemed sort of possessed. I mean, she quoted large passages from these esoteric books, and they fit very much into my character, into Felicity. So what I did is I immediately started writing down everything Michelle was saying, because I knew that this was an unrepeatable event. I threw out a lot of what I had already written about my character, and I put in what she told me. And sure enough, I knew her, then knew her for 2 years. Well, she's still living in New Orleans. And not once did she ever quote anything of that nature. We never even had a discussion that came close to being as esoterically bizarre and strange as that, you know. So, chalk it up to New Orleans. I have no experience. Things like that happen. So, as I've said before, the dead are a great presence in New Orleans. So, for a time, I lived right near the Lafayette Cemetery, where I like to take my friends from out of town for a cup of coffee in the morning. For a quiet chat, you know. So, no, you get the coffee before you go into the cemetery. It's not like Starbucks. You don't think they have waiters in New Orleans cemeteries? Although they might, you know. I mean, it's that kind of city, you know. That would be very New Orleans, actually, waiters in cemeteries. So on the uptown side of Lafayette Cemetery on Britannia Street is the house where 23-year-old F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote his first book, This Side of Paradise. The dead are buried above ground in New Orleans because there is water less than 5 inches under the ground, and anything you put in there floats and rots. The rounded mausoleums at the Lafayette remind me of bread ovens. I think of the dead as loaves of bread, quietly mummifying there under the blistering New Orleans sun. Perhaps when they are crisp like the baguettes at La Madeleine, they are allowed to leave their graves and frolic with the other inhabitants. We bake in purgatory, Dante said, before we are set on the table of judgment, sure to hear our story again. Quote. I brought a great Polish artist named Wodiko here one afternoon. We sat on the grave of one Franz Caillou with our coffee, and he told me about a high school student strike he led in Warsaw in 1976. He took all his classmates to the Warsaw Cemetery, and they studied history there from the gravestones. It was the true history of Poland, not the lies they were being taught in school. They looked up the heroes of Polish history who were forbidden by the communists at that time, and learned more in one day than they ever had in high school in a year of history, just by reading the tombstones and Wodiko telling them the stories. And really, that's not a bad idea for any school, actually. If teachers took their students to cemeteries instead of boring them to death in classrooms, you know, I think you'd get quite a bit. Of course, in New Orleans cemeteries, of course, they tell great stories. The cemeteries tell great stories because there's so many of them, and so many of them, so many cemeteries and so many tombstones that can be read, just like stories, and you can tell the stories from what you read on them. And because it's an old city, there are more dead people than living people there, you know. And the dead are not all that dead. Witness Riesenstein, and then later people like Anne Rice, who wrote Interview with a Vampire and lived in New Orleans for quite some time and caught on to, of course, you know, the kind of strangeness and essence of this business of living forever. Anyway, after Wodiko and I had finished our black coffee, we went to Commander's Palace restaurant to see if we could get in for lunch. Now, Commander's Palace is one of the world's best restaurants and is right on the other side of the Lafayette from where young F. Scott wrote his book. And usually you need a reservation about 3 days in advance for Commander's Palace, but you never know. So we asked the young man there, and he said, oh, no, there's no way you can get in now. And I said, hey, I pointed to Wodiko, and I said, do you know who this is? This is Václav Havel, the president of Czechoslovakia. So this guy looked us over for about a second, and so doubtfully, and then disappeared to consult with his boss. And, you know, so we fiddled with our souvenir sprigs of sweet olive, and we stared at the walls, which have pictures of Victorian and roaring 20s New Orleanians on the walls. And he came back shortly with his boss in tow, Helen, actually, who I got to know. Normally, she said, we only do this for old New Orleans families and Hollywood stars, but I'll make an exception this time. This way, Mr. Havel. I mean, she knew who Havel was. The other guy didn't know. So when we were seated before the large windows in the upstairs room, Wodiko said that he felt very privileged indeed. A huge live oak stood outside, big enough to live in. He had the turtle soup. The turtle soup at Commander's is said to be over 100 years old. They say that the turtle soup pot has never gone out since the restaurant opened on these premises in 1888. One time there was a fire, and the first thing the cooks did was to take the turtle soup pot outside. Then the building burned down. There is something indescribably comforting in knowing that you're eating from the same pot with your dead ancestors. The secret charm of old restaurants is precisely this sense of continuity. You sit down where someone sat 100 years before you. They sat down, told a story, and died. Life goes on. Old cities soothe and ease the pain of living because wherever you are, someone else was there before, had troubles worse than yours, and passed on. I don't see how people can inhabit spanking new suburbs without succumbing to terminal anxiety. We need the dead to make us feel alive. In New Orleans, they are at it full time. After we had our soup, we strolled back up to Britannia Street toward my house. I wanted to show Vodika my fig tree and to give him a bag of fresh, ripe figs to take with him to Warsaw because they've never seen figs outside a can over there. Well, more stories follow. We passed the Boltman Funeral Home on the way. We're on a team here. The Boltmans buried anybody who's anybody in New Orleans for 3 generations. They are also art lovers and patrons. Frances Boltman, the family matriarch, left her art collection to the New Orleans Art Museum. The museum honored her at a fabulous party, actually, at which the sick elderly woman was laid on an elaborate sort of catafalque-like divan, as the best of New Orleans society in the art world filed by to pay their respects, and men sort of gallantly kissed her hand, and the hand that deeded all that art to the city, and women wore fabulous gowns, which in New Orleans are always a little more fabulous than anywhere else. And I overheard the local artist, actually, who whispered that Frances looked much better than she did. Later, I'm sorry, I'll skip something here. So this is the museum. Well, later she was laid out when she died at the Boltman Funeral Home, and pretty much the same people came by, except nobody obviously touched her in any way. And but then a young artist said she looks better than she did at the museum. So. Well, of course. At some point during her long life, Frances Boltman gave young Tennessee Williams a place to stay in an apartment at the back of the funeral home. She put him up because he didn't have a place to live. And Tennessee wrote, "Cat on a hot tin roof" there. And liked New Orleans so much, he got his own apartment a short time later in the French Quarter and became really a lifelong resident. Of course, he lived in New York as well, but he spent as much time as he could in New Orleans. So, I wrote just a little bit of this. Vodiko wanted to know what time it was because he had a plane to catch in 2 hours, and neither one of us wore a watch. And I pointed out a big clock in front of the Boltman Funeral Home, which is one of the very few public clocks in New Orleans. The rest of them are also on funeral homes. There's no other public way of telling time. In New Orleans, if you don't have a watch, you have to die before you can find out what time it is. But the real reason for the dearth of clocks is that time is not a big deal here. New Orleans is approximate. Nobody gets to parties for at least 1 hour after the official time. Everything takes longer, even the simplest things. Buying a newspaper can take a half an hour if the vendor feels like telling you a story. Waiters may hang by your table, pencil in the air, for the space of several stories if you ask something interesting. They'll tell it to you. People can be screaming, they don't care. New Orleanians are great talkers, and they consider time well spent and very relative if they remember something they want to tell you or simply feel like commenting on the weather or the political climate, which is spicy in Louisiana, like the food. Everyone is extremely well-mannered, and manners take time to perform and to execute. Nor do stories get carelessly told. My students will invariably preface and footnote a tale while they tell it, and they have a great sense of timing. They may have difficulty spelling some of the words they say, but they speak like angels, They do it for a long time. And that's, part of the culture of the place. And it goes on with more stories of that nature, all of which were to some extent, love stories to the city of, love letters to the city of New Orleans. And some tough stories I wrote about New Orleans, because New Orleans is also a hard city to live in, because it's been corrupt for a long time. And it's hard to get things done. And there are ways of doing things that are not the way they're done in most of America. You have to know people, you have to do this, you have to do that. And at various times scandals break out in the newspapers, and they are big, and they involve everybody in the police department, for instance. And I followed some of those stories too, so I wrote some very tough stories about New Orleans, which you know, some people didn't like at all, because I was, you know, blowing the, I was the whistle on, you know, the locals like to think that they live in a separate world, and so if you publish things in a national newspaper, they feel slighted, you know. But in fact, it all resounds to the character of the city, that you can talk about it. I mean, the city doesn't have an inferiority complex. It's certainly not one when it comes to corruption. You know, it's as good as Chicago used to in the old days. But you know, all of that changed, of course, with Katrina. And now the city is half the size of what it used to be. It's changing very quickly. It is already a very different city. 220,000 New Orleanians are scattered everywhere in America. You know this well, because about 100,000 ended up in Houston, and many of those people are still there. So New Orleans has now become also a city of diaspora, a city of scattered people who tell stories of New Orleans. And so one of the pieces I wrote after the storm, and I wrote a lot after the storm because I reported for National Public Radio. I reported for NBC News. I was in the city 3 days after the storm. The city was completely evacuated, and there was nothing there but National Guards and Army, and it looked like an armed camp, and, you know, a city of armed men, you know, but no inhabitants. Very strange. I wrote a number of pieces, but one of them was called A Letter to America, and I'm going to read it to you, and then maybe we can just have a conversation. You can ask some questions about anything you like. After the deluge, a letter to America. There will be a little bit of New Orleans everywhere when our refugees move into your communities. Here are some of the changes. Your food will get better. In the past 10 years, thanks to Asian and Latin flavors brought in by immigrants, American food improved. Now it will reach sublimity. Instead of canned music, you will have the real live thing. Clubs will mushroom, and street performers will make your town a livelier place. Start working now to remove the tight-ass rules that forbid street theater. Get ready to hear strangers open up to you in public places and tell you stories. You will remember that once upon a time, before television, people used to say hello to strangers and tell them stories. Several times a year, there will be festivals and parades that will remind you ritually that it's okay to be alive and you don't have to work like a dog without any joy in this lifetime. There will be new coffee houses, bars, and community centers where you will hopefully forget to be a couch potato. Sure, you might become a barfly instead. But I'll take a living human drunk over a phony electronic pixel vampire. Many people will shoot their televisions. That's inevitable. Speaking of shooting, the gun business will boom as it is doing right now. And when I wrote this, it was booming. It's, you know, it hasn't stopped. Other businesses will boom as well as skilled manual laborers from New Orleans pour in. Just don't expect them to finish anything on time. The real estate market is booming already. Schools will be filled to capacity, and there will be a need for more teachers. There will also be more jobs for doctors, nurses, firemen, policemen, and criminals. You will experience an overnight growth in self-esteem as our refugee poets and writers begin to use your city as a source of material. You will also experience an equal plunge into embarrassment when they reveal what they found out. You will no longer experience any faith in your government, if you still have any. Our refugees will teach you how to be self-reliant, dependent on your community, and live without any faith in the government. The bums who run the country now will be swept out of power. First Bush and his cronies, then all the spineless officials and bureaucrats wasting your money in Washington. You will be renewed by the intelligence of a whole culture, just the way we were renewed by the refugees of Europe after Second World War. On the downside, you will start smoking again. Thank you. Well, I'll be glad to, have a conversation, answer questions, especially if I don't know the answer. I'm of the school that the French call pataphysics, which is giving imaginary answers to real questions. The Académie de Pataphysique specializes in that sort of thing. Yes?
I'm just wondering how Romania is doing these days.
It's a good question. I follow that country now. It's been 18 years since 1989. A whole generation of young people have grown up that really don't remember communism, and they don't know what it was like before. And they're pretty much still in love with most things Western. If you go to Bucharest now, part of the city, you could be anywhere in Europe. This year, Romania joined the European Union. They're in the EU, which is both hardship and problematic because nobody has any money, and so the natural economy is back in a way that it wasn't since 1989. People will trade things like small pigs for carpentry work, which is, fine and approximate, but so the cities are doing better, and some cities in Transylvania, where I was born in Transylvania, actually, and of course everybody asks, but, I don't tell. But the cities in Transylvania are doing better because there's a lot of German investment there, German money, because they used to be all German towns, and now Germans are coming back and investing in there. And then the countryside is pretty devastated because a lot of the men are working abroad to make money and bring it back. And so there are a lot of villages where there are only older women and children. And so the countryside is in trouble. But, it's doing much better. I mean, in 1989, when I went there to cover the so-called revolution they had, there was still shooting going on. Nobody knew exactly who was shooting at whom. This was one of the great mysteries of the Romanian Revolution, a great story. But it was a drab country then, and people were still depressed, and they had all those years of privation and of silence and of, upset. And they were slowly waking up, and they didn't know how to act free. They talked. I mean, there was an awful lot of talk. There were a lot of newspapers. The names of things were being changed. There's a lot of fervor, but not, somewhat on the surface. So, slowly, it has gotten better. It's an actual functioning, democracy flaw. I mean, I'm not sure why you asked the question. You probably know something about Romania. Because I know quite a few people have gone, yeah.
When you came to the United States, how did you gravitate to New Orleans and Louisiana?
Well, that happened much later. When I first came to the United States, I went to Detroit, Michigan, which is apparently a good training ground for writers who don't drive. Yeah. Everybody there was in a car, and I wasn't. And but not long after I left, and I went to New York because I knew that's where all the writers were. And I went to the Lower East Side of New York, Greenwich Village, where all the writers were. And I lived there I had a job, part-time job actually, at the 8th Street bookstore, which was a great writers bookstore. All the writers in New York had charge accounts there, so you could, Philip Roth and Eisner, all these people would come in and buy books, and so all of us young clerks who were writers in training would take home all the books that all the big writers read. Then we got an education very quickly. We knew all the books that the big writers were interested in, and I was paying $60 a month for a pretty miserable apartment on Avenue C, and my then wife worked as a model at the art school where she was taking classes, and we just sort of made do in this bohemian New York. And then moved to San Francisco, California in 1970, and then lived briefly in the country in Sonoma. And then all of a sudden, it was about 19 '78, and you just couldn't just be just a poet anymore, because everybody in America started getting up, and going to work. Well, at least, not in our world so much, because we were still, staying up all night. But, it became imperative to make a living. I had 2 kids by then. So I went to Baltimore and I started teaching. And then in 1984, I applied for a job at LSU in Baton Rouge. And we went there and started living there, and I figured Baton Rouge was okay, but New Orleans was a lot more interesting. So we lived in New Orleans, and I just commuted to work. That was fall of 1984. Yes.
What advice do you have for aspiring writers?
Well, I know you're not talking about yourself. Well, it's probably your president is writing a novel, Well, reading is the big secret. You just read. Professor DeLeo and I were just talking about the wonderful old bookstores where you could wander into without really knowing what you wanted, and you just browse, and then somehow something would jump out at you, and it was the thing that you needed, but you didn't know before you went in. You can't really do that on the internet because you have to know what you're looking for. But part of being a writer or a thinking or reflecting person who has a creative thing going for them is to be able to have this sort of dream time where you don't know what you want, but somehow you'll find it if you just go to the right places. And, for us, for my generation, it was really a matter of going to New York or, to places where other writers were, but also to places that had good bookstores and finding things to read and then reading what other writers said about writing. And it was really not so much although I had a good teacher who inspired me in high school. She was great because she read us poetry and she talked to us about literature as if it was a living thing, and it made it very exciting. She communicated all her love for it. But, mostly reading and then figuring out what kind of story you want to tell and what sort of writing you want to do. And, there are all sorts of things that lead you there, but the main thing about being a young writer, and maybe aspiring too, is that you just have to give yourself slack. You just have to give yourself this zone of vagueness and daydreaming around yourself in which things can happen. You can't pretend to know everything. You just have to let things come to you, and it's amazing how miraculously those things do come to you. Yeah. Well, I started writing for the worst of reasons, really, for spite. I was extremely pissed off at my stepfather. My mother had married this guy I don't like at all, and so, I kept sort of fantasizing about, what I could do. Well, I couldn't do anything because I was, 14 years old and 13. And I was reading a lot of books, and I had this, I was imagining... all kinds of things. Especially, I was walking around my hometown imagining my Nobel Prize speech. I wasn't even a writer yet, but I thought, eventually I was going to be a writer, and then I was going to get a Nobel Prize. I was going to give a speech before the Nobel Committee and the world in which I enumerated all the horrible things this guy did to me. In order, because I didn't forget anything, And then I started writing, some poems that were... sort of an expression of my feelings, so I wasn't terribly happy. But then I found approval for them because, my teacher again, found them interesting, and she liked them. And I started reading them to some of my contemporaries. I had some friends, and I would read them my poems, and they seemed to think that was a cool thing to do, especially if they seemed to transgress what the adult world wanted and, or thought was appropriate or good. And so, that was inspiring for a while. Then I started reading, and I started to be really inspired by poets who were forbidden. But we had the whole entire pre-war generation of writers in Romania was forbidden by the communist government. These are writers who were listed on the index, and you couldn't find their books. And There was an old retired teacher who started to lend some of us young writers books from his library, and he turned me on to a poet named Lucian Blaga, who had lived in my hometown and wrote a lot about the town. And his poetry was just incredible. It was just his poetry that's very spare, and it was made of these silences, which I kind of recognized. And I mean, I recognized a lot of it, and I felt like, not just that I knew it, that I felt like I wrote them. This is a strange thing that happens. You really identify with some subject matter. And I discovered Blaga, and then after that I just started reading avidly. So I would get inspired by writing, and then sometimes for no good reason at all when I had time. We didn't have so much entertainment to distract us. No television. The radio was really boring. Just had this like awful symphonic noise that came out of it. And the adults didn't talk much to younger people because they didn't want anybody to know what their true thoughts were, because they were being watched. There was this sort of atmosphere of paranoia. So we had time. So in a way, it was ideal, because there was nothing to distract you. And then I read all the books, and everything I looked at seemed interesting. And then at a certain point when I started writing, I decided I was just going to write poetry, that this was going to be my thing. Almost everything I looked at started to be sort of illuminated and inspiring. There was nothing everything became interesting. Things I thought of as boring, like our old chipped sink, or the wall in front of the window at our house, suddenly just started filling themselves with some kind of inspiration. And after that, it was girls.
Professor Codrescu,
Yeah.
could you speak to the virtual American concept that we...
Oh, yeah, sure. Charlie and I talked for a while in the car yesterday about this burning political question of the day, which is the question of borders, and all the political speechifying we hear about borders, and the very real fact of borders. And I've been working on this, on an essay about what I call virtual Americans. Now, these are people who don't live in the United States, who live outside our borders, but spend an awful lot of time in cyberspace. So my assistant at school now, Plamen Arnudov, is from Bulgaria. He came to Baton Rouge speaking perfect English, which he'd learned from Animal Planet and Disney or MTV, whatever he was watching. And his English was very good. And I said, well, Plamen, how much time do you spend did you spend in cyberspace? And he said, probably at some point 9 hours a day. Well, that was pretty remarkable. And then I thought, he writes music too, and he was very familiar with American pop music and all kinds of pop culture stuff. He knew how to download films and all kinds of stuff. And, culturally he was American, but he'd never lived in America one day of his life. And so I figured, there exists now a large world of virtual Americans out there who don't know, who would like to come here and maybe become real Americans. But there's a big disconnect between being a virtual American and being a person living in the real world and meeting, and communicating with real people. And so, Plamen did have a hard time for 2 years or so, because there was a lot he didn't understand. You can speak the language well, you can have your, a vast frame of cultural reference of pop, this and that, but when you come face to face with a person, there's a whole world of signals and communication and stuff that goes on between people, and it's invisible and it can be taught, and often it hasn't been named. And that stuff you can't learn unless you're really in the place. And so, we have on the one hand this kind of virtuality disconnected from reality that seems, pretty complete, but it's not. And things happen, and it's an interesting phenomenon because it is going to be more and more prevalent as time goes by, because we really do have the internet. I mean, it really is mostly an American experience, no matter what the French say about it.
Well, thank you, Professor Codrescu.
My pleasure. Thank you.